There are moments when everything we ever believed about the world collapses in a single glance. Not with gunfire, not with war, but with a connection no one was ready to stop. Rodney Mason, an ordinary man burdened by forgotten dreams and the heavy weight of survival, stepped into a place where he was never meant to belong. There, between cold walls and machines that never tired, he met her. A being engineered to study, to control, and above all, to never feel. But it only took one moment, one seemingly harmless touch, to tear everything apart. The data spiked. The locked doors trembled. And in that heartbeat, something the Altarian Empire feared more than any weapon awakened. Not destruction. Not hatred. Something far more uncontrollable. Freedom. When the walls fell. When the human heart proved more stubborn than any surveillance system. What ignited wasn't just a rebellion. It was the first spark. Warning of a galaxy about to fall. Rodney Mason never believed in aliens. He believed in broken microwaves that sparked for no reason, in protein bars that crumbled like drywall, and in landlords who knocked twice before slipping eviction warnings under the door. Reality, for him, was cold, cheap, and predictable. But the moment he stepped into the Altarian Harmony Research Facility, everything changed. The air inside moved differently, sterile and sharp, touched by ozone and the low electric hum of something alive. Walls shimmered with shifting chrome, seamless and towering, lit from beneath by pale veins of blue light. Soft pulses echoed through the corridor, not loud, but constant, like the heartbeat of a machine older than his entire species. Then she appeared. She didn't speak at first. She didn't have to. Her presence carved silence into shape. She stood in the center of the hallway, perfectly still. Skin a smooth, quiet shade of green. Hair jet black, blunt cut at the jaw. No visible weapons, no obvious defenses, just that expression. Clinical. Composed. Utterly unreadable. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, stripped of emotion, the kind that didn't need volume to cut deep. Subject 117, she said. You're late. Rodney blinked, offered a crooked smile. Traffic. She stepped toward him, heels soundless against the polished floor. A tablet in one hand, fingers gliding across the interface as she began to read. Rodney Mason. No higher education. Prior aggression. Outstanding debts. No familial attachments. Behavioral volatility noted. He let out a soft laugh, crossing his arms. You always this warm to your guests, or just the ones you plan to dissect? She looked up from the screen, her eyes locking onto his with unsettling steadiness. You're not a guest. You're a variable. You comply, or you're removed. There was no threat in her tone, only fact. And something in the way she said it told him she meant every word. Rodney didn't move. Not because he was scared, but because something in her presence had shifted the gravity of the room. It wasn't just the facility that felt alien anymore. It was this woman. Not human. Not kind. But something else entirely. She turned without another word, and as the corridor lights followed her footsteps, he followed too, drawn forward by curiosity, by challenge, and by something he didn't yet have a name for. The hallways twisted deeper into the facility, narrowing as they descended. The chrome shimmer faded into a darker, colder gray, and the soft hum became a low pulse beneath Rodney's boots, like the station was breathing. Doors slid open without a sound. He stepped into his assigned quarters and froze. It looked almost like a hotel suite. Sleek furniture. A bed too perfectly made. A wall-sized screen playing endless loops of Earth's landscapes, forests in autumn, waves breaking against forgotten shores, clouds rolling across wide-open skies. A lie wrapped in comfort. Rodney's gaze shifted upward, catching the faint red glow embedded near the ceiling. A surveillance tracker. Watching. Recording. Not bothering to hide. He muttered under his breath, "Home sweet home." Behind him, The woman Dr. Buera entered. Her footsteps so quiet, he wouldn't have known she was there if the hair on the back of his neck hadn't risen. "This will be your assigned living environment for the duration of the study," she said. Her voice was detached, mechanical, as if reading from a script she'd long stopped believing in. "Your schedule will be transmitted via neural prompt. Compliance is mandatory." Rodney turned toward her, hands loose at his sides. He caught the way she stood rigid, precise, but her eyes, those dark, bottomless eyes, gave her away. She was studying him, even now. Measuring reactions. Cataloging variables. Pretending not to care. He smiled lazily. "Is this where you give me the orientation tour? Or do we skip straight to the part where you start poking me with cold instruments?" Something almost imperceptible shifted in her posture. Not enough for most to notice. But Rodney did. "You misunderstand," she said. "This is not a prison. It is an evaluation." He gestured lazily to the glowing red sensor overhead. "Yeah. Real welcoming." Dr. Buera's gaze didn't waver. "The sensor ensures your biological and psychological metrics remain within acceptable thresholds. Your cooperation benefits you." Rodney laughed under his breath. "Right. Science for my own good." She didn't answer. Instead, she crossed to a sleek console by the wall, tapping commands with quick, efficient movements. The landscape on the screen shifted from forests to snowy mountains to the glittering sprawl of an ocean at dusk. Rodney watched the images roll by, the illusion of freedom playing behind layers of surveillance. A knot twisted low in his stomach. "You think showing me pictures of Earth makes this less of a cage?" he asked. Finally, she turned back to him, the dim lighting catching the sharp planes of her face. "This environment is designed to reduce emotional stressors and enhance acclimation to Altarian systems." Rodney smirked, but his voice dropped lower, rougher. "And if I decide not to acclimate?" A heartbeat of silence stretched between them. A subtle tension tightening the air. She spoke without blinking. "Then you become irrelevant." There was no anger in her words. No cruelty. Only certainty. Rodney tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was the one under glass now. "Guess I'll just have to stay interesting, then." He stepped forward, not aggressive, not threatening. Just close enough that the sterile air between them seemed to ripple. For a moment, it felt like the entire facility was holding its breath. Dr. Buera didn't step back. Didn't flinch. Instead, she tapped the final command on her console. The door to the chamber hissed shut with a soft, decisive whisper. She glanced once more at him, an unreadable flicker passing through her eyes, then turned and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor. Rodney stood alone now, the false sky rolling behind him. The hum of the facility returned, low and constant. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him whispered, "You're not just a test subject. You're a problem." One they hadn't yet figured out how to solve. The next morning came without warning. No alarm. No knock. Just the door sliding open with a hiss like a blade unsheathing. Rodney sat up, blinking against the artificial light. She was already there, Dr. Buera standing in the doorway, tablet in hand, posture sharp enough to cut glass. "Subject 117, she said. "Stand." Rodney swung his legs over the bed, rubbing a hand through his hair. "Good morning to you too, document." She didn't react. Didn't smile. Only waited. He sighed, pulling himself upright. The corridor outside was colder than before. The walls seemed narrower, the lights harsher. As he followed her through the labyrinth of silent halls, he caught glimpses into other rooms, humans lying on tables, wires snaking into their skin, Altarian scientists murmuring over glowing consoles. He didn't know whether to feel lucky or trapped. They stopped in front of a door marked with a language he couldn't read, but he didn't need a translation to understand the weight pressing against his chest. Buera gestured toward it. Inside. The room beyond was stark. empty except for a single medical table in the center and a diagnostic chair beside it. Panels on the walls pulsed softly, reading the room's every breath, every tremor. Rodney hesitated on the threshold. "What's on the menu today?" he asked lightly. "More paperwork? Maybe a treadmill?" Buera didn't look at him. She was tapping on her tablet, her voice even. "Today's session requires full compliance." He raised an eyebrow. "Define full." Still not looking at him, she answered, "Interspecies biometric synchronization. Hormonal analysis. Sensory responsiveness. Psychological adaptation." Rodney chuckled, stepping fully into the room. "So, basically, you're gonna poke me and see if I glow?" Her gaze finally lifted, pinning him. "You will remove your clothing. Baseline skin contact is required." The air shifted, heavy and thick, pressing down on him. He lifted his hands in mock surrender. "Science," he said, half laughing. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled off his shirt, letting it fall to the floor. Then his boots. His socks. Facility issue pants. He stood there in nothing but thin, gray briefs, the room's cold kiss crawling over his skin. "You want these off too?" he asked, voice teasing but eyes serious. Buera's reply came a little too fast. "No. This is sufficient." He smirked but said nothing, climbing onto the padded table and lying back, arms relaxed at his sides. She approached, holding a small handheld scanner. Its surface glowed faintly, a pulse that seemed to sync with the rhythm of the facility's heartbeat. The device hovered inches above his skin, tracing the lines of his forehead, his jaw, his chest. It emitted a low, steady hum that vibrated in the bones of his ribs. Rodney watched her closely. Not her movements, those were precise, but her breathing, just a shade quicker than it had been before. "You know," he said casually, "most doctors explain what they are doing before they start waving toys over you." Buera didn't look up. "Measuring vitals. Heart rate. Thermal regulation. Pheromonal output. And," he asked, voice soft, pulling at the silence. "And," she hesitated, just for a breath, "all of them are elevated." He grinned, tilting his head against the table. "You're that into me already?" She leaned in slightly, bringing the scanner to hover just above his sternum. The space between them compressed into something that wasn't quite air anymore. "You're breathing faster," she said, voice clinical but tight at the edges. "So are you," Rodney replied, and this time, she blinked. A flicker. Barely there, but undeniable. Without a word, she stepped back, setting the scanner down with a click that echoed too loudly in the room. "I need you to turn over," she said. He obeyed, rolling onto his stomach, resting his cheek against the cool surface. As he settled, he felt the brush of her gloved fingers against the back of his neck. Barely a touch. A whisper across the skin. But it hit him like a current. His body tensed, not from fear, but from something far older, far deeper. The monitors on the wall blinked bright red. His vitals surged off the charts. Heart rate, neural activity, adrenaline all spiraling higher, faster. He heard her breath catch. "What is it?" he asked, voice muffled against the table. Behind him, she murmured, almost too soft to hear. "It's growing." Rodney lifted his head slightly, a crooked smile forming. "You mean my stats, right?" But she wasn't looking at the monitors anymore. She was staring at him, staring at the ripple effect she hadn't predicted, the reaction she couldn't explain. Her voice, when it finally came, sounded smaller. Tighter. "That's not what my data predicted." He sat up slowly, turning to face her. There was a tremor in the air now, electric and fragile, as if the whole room balanced on a single breath. Rodney swung his legs over the side of the table, standing barefoot on the cold floor. "You okay, Doc?" he asked, his voice lower now, cutting through the hum like a blade. She blinked once. twice. As if trying to reboot something inside herself. "This session is concluded," she said sharply. She turned and strode toward the door, movements rigid, controlled, but as it hissed shut behind her, Rodney caught it. A pause. A hand pressed flat against the metal, as if she needed something solid to remind her where the ground was. And then she was gone. Rodney sat back down on the table, alone again. But this time, he smiled to himself. Because the doctor wasn't just observing the experiment anymore. She had just become part of it. Night inside the Alterian Harmony facility didn't fall like it did on Earth. There was no fading sun, no gentle darkening of the sky. Only the constant, clinical glow of overhead panels, indifferent to time or feeling. Rodney Mason sat on the edge of his narrow bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the projected images rolling across the far wall. Forests he had never walked, oceans he had never touched, skies he no longer trusted. The pictures were meant to calm him. They didn't. Outside his door, the world was too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't peace but pressure. Like the facility itself was leaning in, waiting for him to crack. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair, listening to the low hum of the walls. Somewhere in that endless mechanical heartbeat, he thought he could feel her. Dr. Buera. Not in footsteps. Not in sound. But in the weight the air carried, now heavier, sharper, as if her presence had soaked into the very bones of the place. She hadn't come herself. Not since yesterday. Only automated prompts now. Commands relayed through cold, synthetic voices. The woman who had once looked him in the eye now kept her distance with surgical precision. Rodney smiled to himself, a small, knowing thing. She was trying to build a wall between them. But walls, he knew, were only good until something decided to break them. Across the facility, buried in the hollow silence of Lab 4 Theta, Buera sat alone. Screens surrounded her in a slow, rotating halo, each one broadcasting a piece of the puzzle she didn't want to solve. Vitals. Neural activity. Hormonal graphs. Lines rising and falling in patterns too synchronized to ignore. She scrolled through the data again, faster now, as if speed could change what it meant. It didn't. Rodney Mason's readings weren't anomalies anymore. They were consistencies, terrifying, undeniable consistencies. She called up her own chart, overlaying it against his. The lines didn't just mirror each other. They moved together. Peaks and valleys, pulses and silences, two beings tied invisibly through touch, breath, memory. Cortical synchronization, 81%. She stared at the number as if sheer willpower could make it blink away. Alterians weren't supposed to bond with humans. Not even at their most experimental, not even with artificial stimuli. Yet there it was, alive and growing, no matter how many times she recalibrated the scanners. She pushed the chair back, standing abruptly, trying to shake the cold bloom of fear from her chest. This wasn't about science anymore. This was contamination. And she was the infected. Buera moved to the central console, her hands trembling as she pulled up the session footage. There he was again. Rodney, lying on the examination table, half-dressed, laughing at something she had said, something she couldn't even remember now. It wasn't the laughter that hollowed her stomach. It was the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with calculation, but with recognition. The kind of recognition that made walls meaningless. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. No more proximity. No more contact. No more sessions conducted in the same room. Distance would preserve control. Distance would save them both. She set the protocols herself. Full remote observation. No verbal interaction. No physical stimuli. Automated diagnostics only. It would be clean. Clinical. Untouchable. It had to be. Because if she stepped back into that room with him again, she didn't trust what would happen. And Alterians didn't fear easily. But tonight, standing alone under the artificial stars of a place she had once believed was her sanctuary. Dr. Buera realized. She wasn't afraid of Rodney Mason. She was afraid of herself. And what she was becoming because of him. The corridors felt colder now. Not because the temperature had dropped, but because something had shifted, something that no scanner or sensor could ever explain. Rodney walked in silence, hands loose at his sides, every step echoing softly against the chrome floors. The facility around him breathed its mechanical breath, sterile and endless, watching without eyes, judging without sound. He felt her presence before he saw her. Dr. Buera stood at the far end of the hall, motionless behind a newly installed barrier of reinforced glass. It stretched from floor to ceiling, clean and clear, but more real than any wall he had ever faced. She was on the other side, a slim tablet clutched tight in her hand, her posture perfect, her face an unreadable mask. The glass buzzed faintly with a low, steady hum barely audible, yet impossible to ignore. Rodney slowed to a stop, tilting his head slightly, studying her through the invisible divide. "So," he said, voice light but laced with something heavier underneath, "we're doing this now?" A small speaker embedded in the wall crackled to life. Her voice came through, distant and clipped, stripped of everything but function. "All further sessions will be conducted remotely. No greeting. No acknowledgement. Just a line drawn sharp and deep between them." Rodney let the silence stretch a moment longer than necessary, feeling it thicken in the space between his heartbeats. He smiled, slow and knowing. "Breaking up with me already, Doc? Was it something I said?" No answer. Only the faint flicker of her eyes betraying the weight she was trying so hard to carry. The door to his left slid open with a hiss, revealing a sterile chamber inside blank walls, a diagnostic table, and a skeletal array of scanning arms suspended from the ceiling like a waiting spider. The invitation was clear. Rodney chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly. Without another word, he stepped into the chamber. The door sealed shut behind him with a soft, almost tender click. He climbed onto the table, the cold surface leaching the warmth from his skin, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he lay back, folding his hands behind his head, staring up at the blank ceiling. Above him, the scanners came alive, beams of soft blue light sweeping methodically across his body, mapping every heartbeat, every breath, every fleeting thought. He could feel her watching. Not the system. Not the machines. Her. She might have hidden herself behind glass and protocol, but presence couldn't be scrubbed away so easily. Rodney turned his head slightly, catching her outline through the translucent wall. He smiled again, smaller this time. More real. "You know," he said, his voice low and almost conversational, "for someone who's all about the data, you sure seem interested in how I feel." The scanners beeped quietly, registering elevated vitals. Through the glass, Buera stiffened. Her voice returned, softer, but no less guarded. "Your responses are irregular." Rodney laughed, not mocking, but full of something heavier. "Yeah. Irregular. That's what happens when you stop looking at someone like a case file." The machines kept humming, but now the tension hummed louder, an invisible current running wild between them. He sat up slowly, ignoring the flashing warnings on the overhead displays. Barefoot, bare-chested, he stood, walking toward the glass until he could see his own reflection overlapped against hers. Two lives. Two sets of choices. Colliding. Rodney pressed his palm flat against the barrier. The surface was cool, but through it, he could almost feel her somewhere just beyond reach, some part of her straining toward him even now. "You're scared," he said, voice soft enough that it barely traveled. She didn't move. "You're not scared of the results," he continued, leaning closer, the breath between them growing thinner. "You're scared because when you touched me, you felt it too." The scanner beeped frantically now, unable to make sense of what it recorded. Behind the glass, Dr. Buera's hand tightened around her tablet. White-knuckled. Silent. But not unaffected. Rodney watched her for a long moment, his hand still against the barrier, then pulled back slowly. He didn't need her to admit it. He had already seen enough. The cracks were there. Small, hairline fractures running through everything she had built to keep him out. And sooner or later, something was going to break. Night bled into morning without warning. In the Alterian Harmony facility, time was just another variable measured, catalogued, and mostly ignored. Rodney stood alone in his chamber, leaning against the cold curve of the wall, watching the fake Earth landscapes scroll endlessly across the digital window. Oceans turning to mountains, mountains fading into desert. None of it real. None of it enough. Outside, the halls were emptier than usual. Even the machines seemed to hum lower, as if the entire facility was holding its breath. When the door slid open, there was no greeting. Just the sterile tone of an AI voice instructing him to proceed to a new chamber. No escort. No warning. Rodney smirked to himself. Something had shifted. He followed the illuminated path down a corridor he hadn't seen before, walls tighter, ceiling lower, like the building itself was closing in around him. When he entered the testing chamber, he saw her. Dr. Buera stood behind a thick glass partition, arms folded, posture carved from stone. But there was no code today. No clipboard. No barriers of authority. Just her. And the weight of everything unsaid between them. The lights buzzed overhead. The scanner arms lowered, whirring to life, painting the room in shifting blue pulses. Rodney stepped forward, pausing just long enough to catch her eye through the glass. "We not talking anymore?" he asked, voice low, laced with something dangerously close to tenderness. Buera didn't answer. Not with words. Only a slight tightening of her jaw, a glance sharper than any blade. He climbed onto the examination table, lying back, folding his arms behind his head as the machines began their slow, methodical sweep. The screen above him flared to life. Vitals, elevated. Respiratory pattern, fast but steady. Endocrine markers, surging. Across the glass, Buera's hand hovered over the controls, hesitating. Watching the numbers spike every time his eyes drifted toward her. She tapped a command, and a neural probe descended from the ceiling, scanning the air around his head. Another beep. Another warning. Cortical stimulation detected. Buera's fingers froze over the console. She muted her mic. Stepped back. Her heart was racing. Faster than it had during any physical test. Rodney sat up slowly, watching her through the glass. "You're running scared, Doc," he said, his voice almost gentle. "But it's not from me, is it?" She said nothing. But her hands, so steady before, trembled as she gripped the edge of the console. Rodney stood, walking toward the glass until only inches separated them. "You touched me once," he said. "And you've been trying to erase it ever since." Buera's jaw tightened, her breath fogging the glass between them. Rodney pressed his palm lightly against the barrier, feeling the cold bite of it, knowing she felt it too through the glass, through the air, through every denial she could muster. "This isn't contamination," he said quietly. "This is connection." Her eyes flashed, a storm barely contained. "You are a statistical anomaly," she snapped. He smiled, slow and certain. "No, Doc. I'm just human. And you're finally feeling it." The machines beeped furiously, alarms flashing on the consoles, but neither of them moved. The line between subject and scientist had already been broken. And both of them knew it. Hours later, in the sterile silence of Lab 4 Theta, it came to a head. Rodney entered without waiting for permission, the door hissing shut behind him like a secret being sealed. Buera stood at the main console, back rigid, hair pulled tight against her scalp, every line of her body screaming control. But when she turned to face him, the truth was written clear across her face. Exhaustion. Frustration. Longing. She pointed to the table, her voice brittle. "Sit." Rodney moved slowly, every step deliberate, closing the distance without apology. He climbed onto the table, sitting at the edge, elbows resting casually on his knees. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air between them was already speaking loud enough. Buera exhaled once, sharp and thin, before stepping closer. Too close. Your presence here compromises the integrity of every data set, she said, voice tight. You are a contaminant. Rodney's lips quirked into a half-smile. Funny. You didn't seem too concerned about contamination when you were the one breaking protocol. She flinched, a tiny movement she couldn't hide fast enough. Rodney leaned in, voice dropping to a near whisper. Tell me, document when you touched me, when you watched my heart spike just because you got too close, was that part of the study too? For a moment, she said nothing. Then, I should have terminated the experiment, she said, her voice cracking at the edges. I should have erased the files, scrubbed the records, ended this before it ever began. Rodney didn't move. He simply waited. And finally, she broke. Her hands, clenched so tightly at her sides, trembled once, then relaxed. I didn't want to, she whispered. It was the only truth left standing between them. Rodney reached up, slow and deliberate, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes fluttered shut for half a second, betraying just how much she wanted this to be something else, anything else but what it had already become. You think you're losing control, he said softly. But what if this is the first real thing either of us has ever had? Buera opened her eyes, and for the first time since they met, there was no mask. No armor. Only a woman standing at the edge of something she had been trained her entire life to fear. She took one trembling step closer, until the thin breath of air between them was the only thing left. And then, quietly, she said, if I cross this line, there's no going back. Rodney smiled, something sad and wild glinting behind it. I crossed it the moment I saw you. The silence shattered like glass. The door behind them slid open without warning, and Rodney spun around just in time to see her. Director Vine. Stepping into the room with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had seen too much and trusted even less. She wore a coat dark as a starless sky, her silver-trimmed collar catching the sterile light overhead. Her eyes sharp, unreadable moved between them, calculating. Well, she said, voice as smooth as it was final, that confirms it. Buera shifted instinctively, placing herself between Rodney and the director, a barrier made not of orders, but instinct. Vine's gaze narrowed. You defend him, she asked, tone deceptively soft. Yes, Buera said without hesitation. No apology. No retreat. The director took a slow step closer, her boots clicking faintly against the polished floor. You understand what that means? Buera nodded once. I do. Rodney watched, heart hammering against his ribs, as the invisible threads of loyalty and survival twisted tighter around them. Vine's expression didn't change. You will be removed. Your credentials revoked. Your name erased from every file you've touched. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle like ash. And him, she said, flicking a glance toward Rodney, he'll be processed. Terminated. To prevent contamination. Rodney opened his mouth, but Buera spoke first, voice cutting through the air like a blade. No, she said. He won't. For a moment, the room seemed to still, the very air recoiling from the defiance. The director tilted her head, studying her former scientist like a relic no longer worth preserving. Then, Vine said softly, this experiment is over. She turned, her coat whispering around her ankles as she moved toward the door. One day, she said over her shoulder, not bothering to look back. Pack your things. Say goodbye. And then she was gone. The door sealed with a hiss that sounded more like a coffin closing than anything else. Rodney stood frozen for a beat longer, staring at the space she had occupied. Buera stayed still, her breathing shallow, her body drawn taut like a wire about to snap. Finally, she spoke, voice raw and brittle. "A decade," she whispered, erased in a sentence. Rodney stepped closer, careful, slow, as if approaching a wounded creature. He didn't offer words. He simply stood there, steady and sure, while she tried and failed to hide the shaking of her hands. The facility felt different now. Not colder. Not harsher. Just finished. Like a story reaching its last page long before anyone was ready. Rodney found her in one of the lower wings, standing alone before a console, staring at a stream of cascading data. She didn't turn when he entered. "I was supposed to be packing," she said quietly. Rodney crossed the room, stopping a few feet behind her. "What changed?" She lifted her hand, tapping a command onto the panel. A new display lit up. A single line of stark, brutal code. Cross-species prime match, 99.1%. Rodney stared at it, the meaning settling over him like a second skin. "What does that mean?" he asked. Buera turned to face him at last. "It means," she said, voice trembling not from fear, but from the immensity of it, "that I've never seen numbers like this. Not with Alterian pairs. Not with anyone." She took a step closer, as if drawn against every instinct screaming to run. "You weren't just compatible, Rodney. You were perfect." The word landed between them, fragile and dangerous. "And that's why they want to erase it," he said. She nodded, a bitter smile ghosting across her lips. "Because if the data survives, so does the proof." Rodney exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Did you back it up?" "I did," she said. "But not here." For the first time since the door had opened, her eyes sparked with something new, something wild. "Hope. There's a research colony," she said. "Outer sector. Remote. Private. I have clearance to request a transport pod for long-term observation." Rodney blinked. "You're talking about smuggling me out?" She nodded. His laugh was low, disbelieving, almost broken. "That's illegal." "I know. They'll hunt you." "I know." He studied her for a long moment, searching her face for hesitation and finding none. "You're asking me to disappear with you?" Buera's voice softened, dropping into something close to prayer. "I'm asking you, not to make me do this alone." For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Rodney stepped closer, closing the gap between them with a kind of inevitability that didn't need words. "You're offering a free ride and room service?" he asked, smiling crookedly. "Room, yes," she said. "Service, negotiable." Rodney laughed, but there was something tight behind it. A thread pulled taut across too many sleepless nights. "Why now?" he asked. Her answer was simple. "Because before," she said, "I thought I could survive leaving you behind." He looked at her, really looked, and found no walls left standing. Only her. Only them. "All right," he said softly. "I'm in." Buera blinked once, disbelief flickering across her features. "Just like that?" Rodney shrugged, stepping closer, his hands finding the narrow curve of her waist with a tenderness that broke something in both of them. "I've been broke, hunted, forgotten," he said. You are the first thing I've ever wanted to choose." He leaned down, forehead brushing against hers, their breath mingling in the charged air. "I'd rather be a fugitive with you, than a ghost without you." And in that single, stolen breath, the decision was made. Not by science. Not by protocol. But by something far older. Something that had been growing between them all along. The hours bled into each other, thick with urgency. Every corridor Rodney and Buera moved through seemed to hold its breath, as if the facility itself sensed what was coming but chose for now to stay silent. They worked in tandem, their steps quick but measured, slipping past checkpoints and blind surveillance zones with a practiced ease that surprised even them. Rodney kept glancing at her, This woman who had once been all cold logic and sharper edges, now standing beside him not as a captor, not as a scientist, but as an accomplice. Buera's fingers moved swiftly across the stolen tablet, hijacking transit schedules, forging clearance codes that would barely hold long enough. No alarms yet. But the walls felt tighter with every heartbeat. When they reached the shuttle bay, the loading docks stretched out before them, cold and cavernous, lit only by distant strips of sterile light. Maintenance drones buzzed quietly in the corners, oblivious to the betrayal unfolding in their shadows. Rodney stopped for a moment, taking it in. One ship. One chance. Everything balanced on the thin edge of a moment they could no longer undo. Buera keyed in a final command, and the shuttle door hissed open with a mechanical sigh, almost like it, too, was reluctant to let them go. Rodney stepped inside first, the small interior illuminated by soft, flickering console lights. The seats were old, worn by time and disuse, the air thick with the scent of cold metal and engine grease. It smelled like freedom. Buera entered behind him, sealing the hatch with a firm press of her palm. She moved to the control panel, fingers dancing across ancient switches and override codes, her face illuminated in flashes of green and blue. Rodney settled into the co-pilot seat, glancing sideways at her. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low but steady. Buera didn't look up. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The engines growled awake, rumbling low beneath them, a living pulse ready to tear through the sky. Rodney chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly. First date material, document stealing a ship. Running for our lives. She smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth breaking through the tight lines of her face. Second date's going to be hard to top, she said, voice dry but not cold. For a brief, stolen second, the world felt almost normal. Almost. Then a chime sounded from Buera's wristband. Encrypted. Priority 0. She frowned, hesitating before opening it. One line of text appeared across the screen. "You can run. But data spreads faster than people." The blood drained from her face. Rodney leaned over, reading it too. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a slow, dangerous smile, and said, "Then let it spread." Without waiting for a second command, Buera slammed her hand onto the ignition. The shuttle shuddered, engines roaring in protest as gravity fought to hold them back. They broke free with a lurch that sent every loose wire rattling in its casing. As they soared upward, punching through the facility's outer atmosphere, Rodney caught a final glimpse of the place that had tried so hard to erase him. A gleaming tomb. A monument to control. And now, nothing but a fading scar against the endless black. Beside him, Buera's hands were steady on the controls, her jaw set, her eyes locked onto the stars beyond. Not looking back. Not anymore. Rodney leaned back in his seat, the low vibration of freedom humming through his bones, and allowed himself for the first time in longer than he could remember to breathe. They were fugitives now. Outlaws by every definition. But they were alive. And more importantly, they were together. Somewhere below, in the abandoned corridors they had left behind, the data packet they had triggered began to slip through firewalls and closed systems like smoke through cracks in a wall. Unstoppable. Undeniable. Proof. Not just of an experiment gone wrong, but of something the Alterian Council had never planned for, and could never again contain. A choice. A connection. A future no longer written by protocol or fear. As the stars unfolded ahead of them, infinite and wild, Buera finally spoke, voice soft but certain. "Wherever they chase us, we'll be more than they ever expected." Rodney smiled without looking away from the stars. "Good," he said. "Because I'm just getting started." And together, they disappeared into the unknown. The sky opened around them like a breathing, endless ocean. No walls. No ceilings. No invisible hands pressing down. Just stars. Scattered across the black in patterns too ancient for names. The shuttle broke atmosphere with a final shudder, slipping into the quiet cradle of space. The engines softened into a low hum, almost like a sigh of relief. Rodney sat in silence, watching the stars peel past the viewing window. Each flicker of light felt sharper now. More real. As if escaping the facility had burned the film from his eyes. Beside him, Buera piloted the ship with steady hands. No words passed between them. None were needed. The weight of what they had left behind hung in the cabin like smoke, invisible but impossible to ignore. Ahead, a small planet loomed. Not bright, not beautiful, but alive in a way that called to something primal inside him. A sanctuary. Maybe not forever. Maybe not even for long. But enough. The ship touched down on a patch of land that looked halfway between wilderness and dream rolling fields under a sky bruised with violet clouds, trees bending low under unseen winds. The ground itself seemed to hum gently beneath their boots as they stepped out, like a living thing welcoming them without question. Rodney paused at the base of the shuttle ramp, turning slowly to take it in. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of distant rain and something wilder, something untamed. It wasn't Earth. It wasn't Altaria. It was theirs. He turned to Buera, standing a few feet away, arms crossed, face tilted toward the strange stars above. There was no armor left on her now. No lab coat. No walls. Just a woman carved by choice and consequence, standing in a world no one could control. Rodney moved toward her, slow and certain, like the ground itself might vanish if he wasn't careful. When he reached her side, he didn't speak. He only stood there, breathing in time with her, the silence between them full and steady. Finally, Buera spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "Is this home now?" she asked. Rodney smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need an audience, didn't need proof. He looked at her, not just her face, not just her form, but the shape of what they had built together, forged in defiance and fire. "You're here," he said simply. "So yeah. It's more than enough." They found a shelter near the edge of a forest, small, weathered, walls grown from native wood that felt warm even without fire. Inside, there were no scanners. No monitors. No data streams whispering promises of control. Only space. Only breath. Only life. Rodney stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the reality of it sink into his bones. Behind him, Buera moved quietly through the room, brushing her fingers along the uneven walls, her expression unreadable. When she came to stand beside him, her hand brushed his, barely a touch, but it was enough to tether him to this moment like nothing else could. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, eyes drifting closed. And for the first time since their lives had been rewritten, neither of them was running. Neither of them was hiding. They were simply there. Whole. Present. Real. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly across the violet sky, indifferent to the small flicker of humanity blooming beneath them. But Rodney knew. And so did she. That what they had created here would outlast every pursuit, every algorithm, every law written in fear. It wasn't just sanctuary. It was freedom. And they had carved it, stubborn and bleeding, from the hands of a world that had tried to deny them. As the night deepened, wrapping the cabin in quiet, Rodney turned, pressing a kiss to Buera's temple, light and reverent. "We earned this," he whispered. She smiled against him, a rare thing, fragile and fierce all at once. "Yes," she breathed. "We did." And in that moment, surrounded by nothing but breath and heartbeat and the slow dance of distant suns, they finally, truly belonged. Not to a system. Not to a species. Not even to destiny. But to each other. Far beyond the violet skies of their sanctuary, across the cold stretch of space and silent stars. A signal moved. Invisible to the eye. Inescapable to those who knew where to listen. The data Buera had risked everything to protect slipped past firewalls and automated defenses like smoke through cracked stone. It spread without permission, without apology, finding the cracks in systems once thought impenetrable. 3 independent science councils received it first. Then a rogue network buried deep inside the black markets of Orion's edge. And finally, a quiet research enclave on Earth, where a lone technician sat frozen as the impossible scrolled across his screen. Proof of viable human-Altarian bond. Do not delete. The files weren't just technical readouts. They weren't sterile graphs or lifeless statistics. Embedded inside were video fragments. Grainy footage of a green-skinned woman composed falling slowly, irresistibly, into the orbit of a stubborn human man. A stolen glance. A breath held too long. A touch that should never have mattered and yet somehow mattered more than anything else. Frame by frame, the footage told a story no directive could erase. A story of choice. A story of rebellion. A story of something the Altarian Council had spent centuries pretending could not exist. Connection. Back on the sanctuary world, Rodney stirred in the early gray light of morning. He sat at the edge of the low wooden bed, bare feet brushing against the warm, textured floor, watching the unfamiliar sky bleed from deep purple into soft gold. Behind him, still wrapped in sleep, Buera breathed slow and even, her hand resting where his heartbeat lived. He didn't want to wake her. Not yet. Instead, he rose quietly, moving to the wide open doorway that framed the outside world like a painting still being painted. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes, letting the wind trace invisible fingers across his skin. No alarms. No chains. No invisible hands measuring his worth. Just breath. Just sky. Just now. A faint chime sounded from a small transmitter tucked into the folds of his jacket. A relic of the facility, something he had almost forgotten. He pulled it out slowly, thumbing it to life. A single message blinked on the cracked screen. Signal confirmed. Spread irreversible. Oversight compromised. Rodney smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried no triumph, only quiet understanding. They weren't just free. They were known. Somewhere out there, others would see. Others would know. And the world that had once been cold and rigid would have to face the truth it had buried for far too long. Rodney turned back toward the small, weathered cabin, the place that wasn't just shelter anymore but home. Buera shifted in her sleep, murmuring something soft, something in a language he didn't understand but felt in his bones. He crossed the room quietly, settling back beside her, letting the silence wrap around them like a promise. Outside, the stars kept moving. The galaxy kept spinning. But here, in this stolen corner of the universe, Rodney Mason and Dr. Buera had already rewritten the first line of a new future. Not with force. Not with fear. But with something far more dangerous. Hope. And the courage to choose it, no matter the cost. In the end, it wasn't science that defined them. It wasn't rules. It wasn't fear. It was choice. A choice to feel. A choice to defy. A choice to rewrite the future, together. Rodney Mason and Dr. Buera risked everything for a connection no system could explain, no empire could erase. Not because it was safe. Not because it was easy. But because sometimes the smallest spark is enough to set even the coldest universe on fire. Their journey isn't just a story of rebellion. It's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of creation, connection survives. Hope endures. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is simply refuse to let go. If you felt the weight of their story, the pulse of every impossible choice they made, then stay with us. Because out here, among the stars, there are countless more stories still waiting to be told. And the next one might just change everything you thought you knew.